There she stood in that old farmhouse kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she held the letter from back home. "Come back, Dolly May," it said. "I need a cook now that my wife's gone." But for the first time in her 43 years, she wasn't going to settle for scraps. She looked at Samuel watching her from the doorway, his gentle eyes full of worry, and she knew this was her moment. Either she'd burn that letter and choose love, or she'd pack her bags and go back to being invisible. Her hands were shaking, y'all, shaking like leaves in a storm. What would you do if faced with choosing between familiar pain and unknown love? Now let me tell you about Samuel Hayes, a man who'd forgotten what his own voice sounded like. Out there in rural Nebraska, 1952, where the wind never stops whispering through the corn, Samuel lived in a silence so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. 45 years old, and for 2 long winters he'd been walking around that farmhouse like a ghost haunting his own life. See, his beloved Margaret had been taken by pneumonia, and when she went, she took all the music with her. The neighbors called him the quiet man with the blue barn, because that's about all anyone could say about him anymore. Every morning, Samuel would sit at that old kitchen table, staring at Margaret's empty chair, like maybe if he looked hard enough, she'd just appear with her coffee and that smile that used to light up the whole room. "Morning, sweetheart," he'd whisper to the darkness, his voice so rusty from disuse it barely sounded human. The front porch where they used to sit and watch the sunset, empty as a church on Monday. Even the barn cats had started avoiding him, like they could smell the loneliness coming off him in waves. His days stretched out like that Nebraska horizon, endless, empty, and cold as winter stone. But what Samuel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine as he sat there talking to shadows, was that change was coming. Sometimes life has a way of reaching right into your darkness and pulling you back into the light, whether you're ready or not. And for Samuel Hayes, that change was going to arrive on a Greyhound bus with a cardboard suitcase and a heart full of hope that had been beaten down, but never quite broken. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's continue this exciting story. Now, while Samuel was drowning in his quiet sorrow, some folks in town were cooking up trouble at Murphy's Tavern. Jake Morrison and his crew of neighboring farmers had nothing better to do than sit around that smoky bar, drinking whiskey and letting their meanness grow like weeds after rain. "Poor old Samuel," Jake sneered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Been 2 years now and he's still moping around like a lost puppy. Someone ought to do something about that." That's when the cruel idea took root. These men, bored with their own small lives, decided Samuel needed help, the kind of help that would give them all a good laugh. They contacted a domestic service agency with a request that would make your stomach turn. "Send us the biggest, plainest woman you got. The more hopeless, the better." Their target, Dolly Mae Jenkins, 43 years old, carrying 240 pounds on her generous frame, all the way from rural Alabama. She'd come north after the cotton mill closed, taking her last hope for steady work with it. In her worn cardboard suitcase, she'd packed everything she owned and every dream she had left. Sitting on her narrow boarding house bed, Dolly Mae held that job offer letter like it was made of gold. "Please, Lord," she whispered, folding her few dresses with shaking hands, "let this one be different. Let me finally belong somewhere." She had no idea she was walking straight into a trap designed by cowards who found their entertainment in other people's pain. But sometimes, y'all, what starts as someone else's cruel joke becomes God's plan for something beautiful. That dusty Greyhound bus pulled into town on a Tuesday morning, coughing black smoke like it was tired of carrying dreams that never seemed to come true. Dolly Mae stepped down onto that cracked sidewalk, her cardboard suitcase held together with hope and prayer, her southern accent thick as molasses in the dry Nebraska air. She hadn't taken 5 steps before the whispers started. "Look what Hayes ordered himself," came the cruel voices from Murphy's storefront. "Poor thing don't know what she's walking into." The stares followed her like hungry vultures, picking apart every inch of her generous frame, every trace of Alabama in her voice. Dolly Mae's cheeks burned with shame she'd carried for years, that familiar weight settling on her shoulders like an old unwelcome friend. Each whispered comment was another stone thrown at her already wounded heart. But when she knocked on Samuel's farmhouse door, something different happened. This quiet man with eyes like winter sky didn't laugh, didn't stare, didn't make her feel like some kind of circus attraction. He just looked at her face, really looked at her like she was a person worth seeing. "You must be Miss Jenkins," he said softly. "Would you like some coffee? The journey must have been long." Such simple words, but they hit Dolly May like a warm embrace after years of cold shoulders. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was treating her with plain, human decency. They sat at his kitchen table, two lonely souls sharing awkward but respectful conversation, neither knowing they were about to change each other's lives forever. The difference between Samuel and the rest of that town was like night and day, y'all. While Murphy's tavern crowd spent their evenings making cruel jokes about Hayes's new cook, Samuel was showing Dolly May something she'd almost forgotten existed: simple human decency. He didn't send her away after that first awkward coffee, didn't laugh behind her back or make her feel like some kind of charity case. When mealtime came, he pulled out a chair at his kitchen table, right there beside him, not hidden away in some corner like she was something to be ashamed of. That first dinner together was something special, not because of fancy conversation or romantic nonsense, but because of the warm silence that settled between them. For once in her 43 years, Dolly May wasn't bracing herself for the punchline. She wasn't the joke. She was just a woman sharing a simple meal with a decent man. "Pass the salt, please," he'd say, and those ordinary words felt like music to her ears because they carried no mockery, no hidden cruelty, just normal, respectful conversation between two people treating each other right. Small gestures started growing between them, him asking if she needed anything from town, her noticing he liked his coffee strong in the morning. These tiny acts of consideration were like drops of water on ground that had been dry for too long. For the first time since leaving Alabama, Dolly May dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could belong. But what she didn't know was that this kindness was about to be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. Dolly May's southern cooking became like sunshine breaking through Samuel's gray world. That kitchen, which had been silent as a tomb for 2 long years, suddenly came alive with the smell of real cornbread, creamy grits, and fried chicken that would make angels weep with joy. "Lord have mercy," Samuel said after his first bite of her biscuits, and for a moment something almost like a smile crossed his weathered face. "Haven't tasted anything this good since—" He didn't finish, but Dolly May understood. Since Margaret. But when they ventured into town for supplies, that fragile piece shattered like glass hitting concrete. The general store might as well have been enemy territory. "Look what Hayes brought himself," came the whispered poison. "A big southern belle. Bet she works for just room and board. Poor Samuel must be desperate." Each cruel word hit Dolly May like a physical blow, years of accumulated pain rising in her throat like bile. But then something unexpected happened. Samuel stepped closer, placing his hand protectively on her back. "That's enough," he said quietly to the gossiping women, his voice carrying more steel than they'd heard in years. "Miss Jenkins deserves your respect." Later that night, alone in her small room, Dolly May finally broke. The tears came like a dam bursting. All those years of being nobody, belonging nowhere, never being enough for anyone. "Maybe I should just go back to Alabama," she whispered to the darkness. "Maybe I don't belong anywhere." What she didn't know was that Samuel stood outside her door, listening to her quiet sobs, his own heart breaking for the pain this good woman carried. What touched Dolly May's wounded heart most was what Samuel didn't ask. Never once did he pry into why she'd left Alabama, never made her explain the pain written in the lines around her eyes. That kind of respectful distance was rarer than hen's teeth in her experience. One evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the Nebraska sunset paint the sky like God's own canvas, Dolly May finally found the courage to ask the question that had been eating at her. "Why'd you keep me on, Samuel? I mean, really keep me on?" He was quiet for so long, she thought maybe he hadn't heard. Then, in that soft voice of his, he said, "I needed someone who knew how to stay. Most folks these days, they're just passing through, always looking for something better down the road. But you got staying power." Those words hit her deeper than any fancy speech ever could. Here was a man who saw strength where others saw failure, saw loyalty where others saw desperation. Their days found a gentle rhythm, coffee together as the sun painted the horizon gold, shared meals where conversation flowed easier than Nebraska wind, evening talks on that old porch where silence felt comfortable instead of empty. Both of them carried scars, his from losing the love of his life, hers from never believing she was worth loving at all. But somehow, in the space between his grief and her hope, something beautiful was growing. Neither spoke it aloud yet, but they were healing each other, one quiet morning and peaceful evening at a time. What they didn't know was that their fragile peace was about to be tested by ghosts from both their pasts. The truth came crashing down on a Thursday afternoon when Jake Morrison and his crew rolled up to Samuel's farm, liquor on their breath and cruel laughter in their eyes. They'd come to enjoy the fruits of their handiwork, expecting to find Samuel humiliated and Dolly Mae crushed. "How you liking your gift, Hayes?" Jake sneered, his voice dripping with poison. "We thought you needed some companionship. Asked that agency to send you their biggest, plainest woman. Hope she's working out for you." The color drained from Dolly Mae's face as the horrible truth hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't hired. She was sent as a cruel joke, a punchline for these heartless men's entertainment. But Samuel stepped forward, his jaw set like stone. "Miss Jenkins is my invited guest," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "She's earned my respect, and she'll have yours, or you can get off my land." After they left, still snickering like the cowards they were, Dolly Mae stood in that kitchen feeling like her whole world had crumbled again. "I should have known," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Should have known it was too good to be true." Samuel turned to her, his eyes filled with something she'd never seen directed at her before, fierce protectiveness. "I see a woman who faces a world that never made space for her and still keeps standing. That's not a joke, Dolly Mae. That's courage." In that moment, something shifted between them. They weren't just two lonely people anymore. They were two souls who decided to stand together against a world that tried to tear them down. That night, as if the heavens themselves were weeping, a fierce thunderstorm rolled across the Nebraska plains, trapping Samuel and Dolly Mae inside the farmhouse together. Rain pounded the roof like angry fists, lightning split the darkness, and the wind howled like something broken. But the real storm was happening inside Dolly Mae's heart. Something about being confined in that small space, still raw from Jake Morrison's cruel revelation, broke down all her carefully built walls. "I'm so tired, Samuel," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. "Tired of always being too much for everybody. Too fat, too loud, too southern. Everywhere I go, I'm the joke before I even open my mouth." Instead of trying to fix her with empty words, Samuel just sat beside her on that old couch, took her trembling hands in his work-roughened ones, and held on. He didn't try to tell her she was wrong or that it didn't matter. He just sat with her pain. "You know what I see when I look at you," he said finally, his voice barely above the storm's whisper. "I see someone who's been knocked down more times than anyone should be, and you're still standing. That's not ordinary, Dolly Mae. That's something holy." For the first time since she'd arrived, they truly saw each other's wounds. She told him about years of rejection, about being invisible in her own hometown. He shared his grief over Margaret, how her loss had left him feeling like half a person. In that storm-lit kitchen, two broken souls found something neither had dared hope for, someone who understood what it meant to carry pain and keep walking anyway. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, like a snake slithering through their peaceful world. Dolly Mae recognized the handwriting before she even opened it. Bobby Ray Hutchins, the man who'd told her years ago she was too fat to be seen with when she dared hope he might court her. "Come back, Dolly Mae," the letter read in his careless scrawl. "My wife passed last month and I need a cook, room and board for keeping house. You always were good at that kind of work." Every cruel word from her past came flooding back like a broken dam. Bobby Ray, who'd laughed when she'd worn her best dress to church hoping he'd notice. Her own neighbors who'd whispered that she was chasing after a man way out of her league. The humiliation of being invisible in her own hometown, existing only to serve others who never saw her as worthy of love. Standing in Samuel's kitchen, that letter shaking in her hands, part of her whispered the old familiar lies. "At least it's home. At least you know what to expect. Maybe scraps are better than nothing." Samuel found her there, tears streaming down her face like a broken-hearted child. He didn't ask what was wrong, just stood in that doorway, his gentle eyes full of worry, waiting for her to speak. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered, her voice breaking like her heart. "All my life I've never been enough for anyone, anywhere. Maybe I should just accept that." But Samuel stepped closer, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. A love so pure and steady it made Bobby Ray's scraps look like the cruel joke they really were. Standing there in that farmhouse kitchen, Bobby Ray's letter trembling in her hands, Dolly Mae looked at Samuel's gentle eyes and knew this was her moment of truth. Either she'd keep settling for scraps, or she'd finally believe she deserved a feast. Without another word, she walked to that old kitchen stove, opened the iron door, and fed Bobby Ray's cruel offer to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, taking 43 years of accepting less than she was worth right along with it. Samuel stepped closer, pulling something from his pocket, a heart-shaped stone polished smooth by his own hands. "Dolly Mae Jenkins," he said, his voice steady as bedrock. "Would you build a life with me? No contracts, no pretending. Just us taking care of this land and loving slow the way you deserve." Through tears of joy she'd never thought she'd cry, Dolly Mae whispered, "Yes, Samuel Hayes, yes." They built a bench under the old oak tree where she loved to read, carving both their names deep into the wood. Samuel and Dolly Mae, 1952. A promise that they belonged somewhere, belonged to someone. 6 months later, even Murphy's Tavern crowd had learned to tip their hats respectfully. The Hayes farm became known for the best southern cooking Nebraska ever tasted. But more than that, it became known as a place where two broken hearts had learned to beat as one. Sometimes, y'all, what starts as someone else's cruel joke becomes God's plan for the most beautiful love story of all. And Dolly Mae Jenkins Hayes finally knew what it felt like to be enough. This story reminds us that sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives become the doorway to our greatest blessings. Dolly Mae could have let those heartless men define her worth, could have settled for Bobby Ray's scraps, but she chose to believe she deserved real love. What about you? Are you settling for scraps when you deserve a feast? Are you letting other people's cruel jokes define your worth? Remember, your value isn't determined by those who can't see it. It's determined by the one who created you and by those who have the wisdom to recognize your true worth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these inspiring stories that remind us we're all worthy of love and respect. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching more life-changing stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul.